powerful secret lay buried for years. A wealthy businessman, desperate to protect his reputation, wrongfully dismissed his maid after discovering she was pregnant with his child. Now, years later, their son stumbles upon the truth, pushing his mother to seek justice for the hardship she endured alone. The warm morning sunlight streamed through the grand windows of the Sinclair estate, casting long, golden rays that glimmered across the pristine marble floor. Helena Ramirez moved silently, her well-practiced hands sweeping the soft cloth over the polished surfaces of the room. Each flick of her wrist was deliberate, betraying years of dedication to a job that demanded perfection. The scent of lemon polish mingled with the soft aroma of fresh lilies arranged in crystal vases enveloped the room, providing an air of meticulous order that masked the tension simmering just beneath its surface. Helena's dark eyes flickered momentarily to the corridor, where Ethan Sinclair's voice resonated, deep and commanding. The walls of the mansion, adorned with rare art and heavy, ornate drapes, seemed to amplify his tone, making it impossible for her to ignore. Ethan was speaking on the phone, his confident cadence rising and falling as he navigated a conversation filled with subtle threats and negotiations. Ethan Sinclair was not just a wealthy businessman, he was a symbol of power, a figure whose mere presence commanded rooms and closed deals with a handshake. However, Helena's association with Ethan was far more complex than the standard employer-employee relationship. She had once known his softer side, the version of him that would smile just for her when they met in hidden corners. She remembered shared laughs and whispered secrets exchanged late at night when the mansion was asleep. The days when he noticed her not as a member of the household staff, but as someone who, for a brief time, made him feel alive beyond his titles. Those memories felt distant now, overtaken by the echoes of a conversation that had left her reeling weeks ago. That day had begun like any other, with Helena methodically moving through the endless tasks of her shift until she'd gathered enough courage to tell him. She recalled standing in the doorway of his home office, the sun slicing through half-closed blinds and casting slatted patterns on the carpet. "Ethan, there's something I need to tell you," she had said, her voice a fragile thread. He'd looked up, the furrow in his brow softening only momentarily before she spoke. "I'm pregnant." The words tumbled out, no longer containable. For a split second, shock registered in his eyes. Then came the mask, an icy calm that she now realized was his shield. "This can't happen," he muttered, each syllable a dagger. Ethan stood, pushing his leather chair back with a scrape that echoed like thunder. His fingers drummed on the polished oak desk as he started pacing, a storm building in his demeanor. "It would ruin everything, my reputation, my standing, my family's name." His gaze slid away from her, his jaw tightening as he avoided meeting her eyes. Helena's fingers had twisted together, knuckles whitening. "I'm not asking for anything," she whispered, though her heart pounded in her chest, begging for something, a flicker of recognition, of shared responsibility. But it didn't come. "I'll make arrangements for you," he continued, eyes fixed somewhere over her shoulder, as if the conversation itself were an unwelcome intrusion. "But you need to leave. I can't have this shadow over me." The finality in his tone left her stunned, as did the realization that the man she thought she knew was receding before her very eyes, replaced by the cold, untouchable figure that commanded boardrooms and headlines. Promises of support never materialized. Instead, an official letter arrived at her modest apartment a week later. A dismissal notice, wrapped in impersonal language that cited downsizing and budget cuts. No mention of the child, no acknowledgement of what they had shared. Just a clean severing of ties, leaving her to navigate a world that suddenly seemed too vast and unforgiving. Now, as she stood in the opulent room, her gaze absently following the intricate patterns on the Persian rug beneath her feet, Helena felt that familiar ache in her chest, a mixture of regret and resilience. She resumed her dusting as Ethan's footsteps echoed down the hallway, his phone conversation drawing nearer. Her pulse quickened, and she forced herself to keep her eyes down, every motion of her cleaning as mechanical as it was necessary. The sound of a door closing somewhere behind her finally released the tension coiling in her spine. 15 years had passed since that day. Bookmark. 15 years had come and gone, sweeping away the fragile remnants of Helena's former life. The mansion, with its sprawling rooms and echoes of a past she wanted to forget, was no longer a part of her world. Now Helena stood in a cramped kitchen, painted a warm yellow but crowded with mismatched cabinets and chipped tiles. The scent of garlic and onions sizzling on the stove replaced the sterile polish of Ethan's estate. This was her world now, modest but filled with a sense of home she had built with grit and sacrifice. Gabriel, her son, was sitting at the wooden table, his dark hair falling into his eyes as he bent over a worn textbook. At 15, he had grown into a mirror of his father, with the same sharp jawline and intense eyes. But where Ethan's gaze held cold detachment, Gabriel's was warm, questioning, and filled with a fierce loyalty that he reserved only for her. "Hey, Mom," he said, not looking up from his book, but smiling at the sound of her footsteps. "Hey, sweetheart," Helena replied, a familiar wave of love washing over her as she set the spoon down and wiped her hands on her apron. She had worked tirelessly over the years, juggling multiple jobs and never letting herself dwell too long on what might have been. Gabriel had been her anchor through every moment of exhaustion, every sleepless night spent worrying about bills and how to stretch one paycheck to the next. But Gabriel was growing older, and with age came questions. These questions Helena had deflected for as long as she could. She caught sight of a shoebox, slightly ajar on the shelf, its contents threatening to reveal truths long buried. A photograph, slightly bent and faded, peeked out. A snapshot of her and Ethan at a charity gala, his arm casually draped around her shoulder, smiles that once seemed genuine lighting up their faces. She glanced away quickly, the memories pressing at the edges of her consciousness like an old wound threatening to reopen. "Mom?" Gabriel's voice snapped her back, more serious now. She turned to find him looking at her with a furrowed brow. He set his pen down, the slight clatter echoing in the small space. "Can we talk?" Helena's pulse quickened. It was rare for Gabriel to initiate these kinds of conversations with such a solemn tone. "Of course," she said cautiously, moving to sit across from him. The kitchen felt suddenly smaller, the air heavy with anticipation. Gabriel reached into his backpack and pulled out that photograph, sliding it across the table. Helena's heart stuttered in her chest as she stared at the image. The years rolled back in an instant, the sound of laughter mingling with the tinkling of champagne glasses, the soft rustle of silk against polished floors. It all came rushing back, unwelcome and raw. "Where did you find this?" she whispered, her voice tight as she looked up at Gabriel. "In one of your old boxes. I was looking for pictures for a school project," he said, his voice probing yet gentle. "Is this man? Is he my father?" The question hung between them, a sharp and sudden silence that felt like the eye of a storm. Helena's shoulders slumped under the weight of the truth she had carried for so long, a truth she had hoped to spare Gabriel from forever. She looked into his eyes, so much like Ethan's, yet so different, and knew the time for silence had passed. "Yes," she admitted, the words slipping from her lips like a confession. "Ethan Sinclair is your father." Gabriel's eyes widened, the realization sinking in with visible force. Anger and betrayal sparked in his gaze, emotions that Helena had feared and fought to protect him from. "Why didn't you tell me?" he demanded, the tremor in his voice betraying the depth of his hurt. "Why keep this from me all these years?" Helena swallowed hard, her own throat tightening. "Because I didn't want you to feel unwanted. When I told Ethan about you, he chose to walk away. I didn't want you to grow up thinking you weren't good enough." The kitchen was silent except for the low sizzle of the forgotten pan on the stove. Gabriel stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "That's not fair, Mom. He can't just get away with ignoring us. You shouldn't have had to do everything alone." Helena looked up at her son, seeing a determination in him that echoed her own. Helena's eyes met Gabriel's, and for the first time she saw not just the boy she had protected but a young man, full of purpose and indignation. His fists clenched at his sides, his jaw set with a resolve that surprised her. It stirred something deep inside her, something that had been dormant for years. The years of struggle, the quiet sacrifices, and the constant reminders of what she had endured alone began to shift as if passed from her weary heart to his untested one. I know it's not fair, Helena whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of years of pent-up frustration. But I tried to move on. I didn't want you to grow up with hate in your heart or to feel like you needed him to be complete. But I do need to know him, Gabriel said, his tone softer now but still firm. He needs to know me, and he needs to take responsibility for what he did. You shouldn't have had to bear this alone, Mom. Helena reached out and took his hand, feeling the steady pulse of his determination. Gabriel had always been strong-willed, a trait he'd inherited from her, but seeing it wielded with such purpose now made her both proud and afraid. The path he wanted to take was fraught with potential pain, and she had spent so long trying to shield him from that. Gabriel, confronting Ethan won't be easy, she said, squeezing his hand as if she could transfer her caution onto him. He's powerful. He'll do everything he can to deny this, to protect his reputation. Gabriel's eyes softened as he looked at her. I'm ready for that, and I think you are too, even if you don't realize it. We've been fighting our whole lives, Mom, just in different ways. Helena's chest tightened. How could she deny him the chance to know the truth, even if it meant facing her own fears? She glanced at the photograph again, the past staring up at her with a familiar, haunting smile. It was time to confront what had been buried for so long. Okay, Helena said at last, a mixture of anxiety and determination settling in her voice. We'll do something about it. I'll find a lawyer, and we'll make him face what he's done. Gabriel's expression shifted, his anger softening into a gratitude that brought tears to Helena's eyes. Thank you, Mom. I know this isn't easy. They sat together at the kitchen table, a silence stretching between them that felt more like a shared understanding than a void. It was as if they were both holding the same breath, waiting for the world to shift under their feet. Helena exhaled first, feeling lighter than she had in years. A new chapter was beginning, one that promised uncertainty, but also the possibility of closure. That night, Helena lay awake in her small bedroom, the sounds of the city outside a familiar lullaby. She thought of the man Ethan had become since she'd last seen him, his name appearing in newspapers and magazines, always attached to some grand success or philanthropic endeavor. To the world, Ethan Sinclair was a man of influence, someone whose smile graced charity galas and who spoke about integrity with an air of absolute conviction. But to Helena, he was the man who had walked away without looking back. Across the hall, she could hear Gabriel shifting in bed, likely as restless as she was. She wanted to call out, to offer some kind of reassurance, but the words stayed trapped in her chest. Instead, she let the silence carry the promise that whatever came next, they would face it together. Morning came, crisp and bright, flooding the apartment with light that felt almost intrusive. Helena moved through her routine with practiced efficiency, her hands steadying as they prepared breakfast. Gabriel emerged from his room, dressed and ready, his school bag slung over one shoulder. He paused in the doorway, studying her as if trying to memorize this version of his mother before things changed. "Ready?" he asked, the weight of the question far beyond their typical morning exchange. Helena nodded, a small, brave smile curving her lips. Ready. It was time to stop running from the past. Go back. Helena stood outside the modest office building, its faded sign reading Margaret Lane, attorney at law. The small law office was tucked away on a quiet street, surrounded by local shops and a park where children played. It was a world apart from the gleaming towers where Ethan Sinclair conducted his business. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the door handle, a mix of nerves and anticipation coursing through her. She turned to look at Gabriel, who stood beside her, his eyes steady and unwavering. "Are you sure about this?" Helena asked, her voice almost a whisper. Gabriel nodded, his determination a force she could almost feel. "Yes, Mom, we're doing the right thing." With a deep breath, Helena opened the door, and they stepped inside. The scent of old paper and wood polish filled the room, giving it a sense of quiet diligence. A middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a kind smile sat behind a cluttered desk. She looked up as they entered, setting down her pen. "Helena Ramirez?" she asked, standing and extending her hand. "I'm Margaret Lane. It's nice to meet you, and you must be Gabriel." Gabriel nodded politely, shaking her hand before they all sat down in the small office. The walls were lined with bookshelves filled with legal texts and framed degrees. A soft ticking from a nearby clock punctuated the silence. "I appreciate you seeing us on such short notice," Helena began, her voice steady but betraying the nervous flutter in her chest. "Of course," Margaret said, folding her hands on the desk. "I read the brief details you mentioned over the phone, but I'd like to hear everything from the beginning. Take your time." Helena glanced at Gabriel, who gave her an encouraging nod. She took a deep breath, fingers twisting together as she began. "I worked for Ethan Sinclair about 16 years ago, as a maid in his mansion. Over time, we developed a personal relationship. When I discovered I was pregnant with Gabriel, I told him, hoping he would do the right thing." Margaret's expression remained calm, but her eyes sharpened with focus. "And how did he respond?" Helena's throat tightened at the memory. "He said it would ruin his life, his reputation, his family's standing. He offered to pay me to leave and keep quiet, but when I refused, he fired me. I was given no severance and no support, just an official letter stating that my services were no longer required." Gabriel's jaw clenched as he listened, the anger simmering beneath his expression. Margaret jotted down notes, nodding thoughtfully. "Did you make any attempts to reach out after that?" Margaret asked. "Yes," Helena said, her voice gaining strength as she recounted the old hurt. "I sent letters, tried to call, but he ignored them all. I kept copies of the letters, hoping that one day—" Her voice trailed off as she glanced at Gabriel. Margaret leaned back, tapping her pen thoughtfully against her notepad. "We can build a strong case for wrongful termination and child support. It won't be easy, though. Ethan Sinclair has significant resources, and his legal team will likely try to discredit you both." Gabriel spoke up, his voice cutting through the room. "We're ready for that. He's ignored us for too long, and it's time he faced the truth." Margaret's lips curved into a slight smile. "Good. That resolve will help. We'll need any evidence you have, letters, documents, anything that shows your employment and relationship with Mr. Sinclair." Helena nodded. "I have the letters and a few contacts from back when I worked there. Maybe they would be willing to testify." "Perfect. We'll also need to subpoena his financial records and any relevant documents that could support your claim," Margaret said, scribbling more notes. "This will be a fight, but it's one worth having, and if we handle it correctly, we have a real chance." A small wave of relief washed over Helena. The first steps had been taken, and while the road ahead would be steep, they weren't alone anymore. As they left the office, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pavement. Gabriel walked with a newfound purpose in his stride, and Helena felt a spark of hope rekindle in her heart. They had just declared the first battle in a war that had been years in the making. The fight for truth and justice had officially begun. The following days were a whirlwind of preparation. Helena spent her evenings sorting through old boxes and envelopes, gathering every piece of evidence she had kept from those days at the Sinclair mansion. The letters she had sent, each one a plea for support that had gone unanswered, were now more than just relics of heartbreak. They were proof of Ethan's deliberate neglect. Each handwritten word told a story, and now those stories would finally have a chance to be heard. Gabriel watched her work, often leaning over the kitchen table to offer help or ask questions about the people she used to know. "Do you think anyone will actually come forward?" he asked one evening, his tone more hopeful than doubtful. Helena set down a letter she had been reading, eyes clouded with the weight of old memories. "I don't know," she admitted. But there were a few who saw what was happening. Rosa and Beatriz, two of the other maids, were always kind. I think they suspected the truth, even if we never spoke about it openly. Gabriel nodded, his expression thoughtful. If they know what he did, they might be willing to testify. We should reach out to them. The next day, Margaret Lane called with updates. Her voice was brisk but encouraging over the phone. "Helena, we're making good progress. I've drafted the initial lawsuit for both wrongful termination and retroactive child support. We'll be serving Ethan Sinclair's legal team within the week. I also reached out to a few potential witnesses, including former staff members." "Thank you, Margaret," Helena said, a mix of gratitude and anxiety tightening her chest. "This is all happening so fast." "It needs to, if we're to catch them off guard," Margaret replied. Sinclair's lawyers will come back hard, so we need to be prepared. Stay strong and gather any other evidence you might have." Helena hung up, the reality of what was about to unfold sinking in. The news would reach Ethan soon, and she could only imagine the lengths he might go to protect himself. But there was no turning back now. For Gabriel, for herself, and for all the years they had suffered in silence, she had to see this through. That night, after dinner, Gabriel sat at the kitchen table, notebook open and pen in hand. "I've been writing down everything I remember about growing up without him," he said, eyes scanning his rough notes. "I thought it might help." Helena's heart ached with pride and sadness as she watched him. "It will, Gabriel. Every detail counts." The days passed in a blur of preparation. Margaret called frequently, each time with updates or requests for more information. Helena contacted Rosa and a few other former colleagues, explaining the situation and asking for their support. To her relief, Rosa agreed to speak with Margaret, confirming that she remembered how suddenly Helena had been dismissed and the rumors that had swirled afterward. A week later, the papers were officially filed. News of the lawsuit spread quickly, and it wasn't long before the media began to take notice. One evening, as Helena and Gabriel returned home from the grocery store, they spotted a small group of reporters outside their apartment building. Their faces were eager, microphones and cameras at the ready. "Helena Ramirez, is it true you're suing Ethan Sinclair for wrongful termination and child support?" One reporter shouted as they approached, the bright light of a camera glaring in their direction. Gabriel tensed beside her, but Helena squeezed his arm gently. She lifted her chin, trying to project the strength she wasn't sure she felt. "No comment," she said firmly, guiding Gabriel past the cluster of journalists and up the stairs to their door. Once inside, they locked the door behind them, the muffled voices of the reporters still echoing in the hallway. Gabriel exhaled, leaning back against the wall. "This is crazy, Mom. It's like our lives have become some kind of story for them." Helena nodded, the weight of their decision pressing down on her shoulders. "It is, but we can't let them get to us. We have to focus on why we're doing this." Gabriel met her gaze, a small smile breaking through the tension. "For us," he said, and Helena felt the warmth of his words fortify her resolve. The fight was only beginning, but they were in it together. The courtroom had a solemn, almost foreboding atmosphere, as Helena sat beside Margaret, her heart thundering in her chest. It was the first official day of hearings, and the room was already filled with reporters, curious spectators, and the faint buzz of whispered conversations. Gabriel sat on Helena's other side, eyes fixed forward, trying to appear calm despite the tight set of his jaw. Across the room, Ethan Sinclair entered, flanked by his high-profile attorney, Thomas Reed. Ethan looked every the powerful magnate he was, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, his expression unreadable. He glanced briefly in Helena's direction, a flicker of recognition in his eyes before they settled into an icy detachment. Margaret leaned over, her voice low but steady. "Remember, no matter what they say, stay composed. This is where we begin to tell our side of the story." Helena nodded, drawing strength from the warmth of Gabriel's hand as it rested on the table, a silent reassurance that she wasn't alone. The judge, an older man with a stern face named Judge Whitfield, called the court to order with the sharp crack of his gavel. The hum of the room fell silent. "Proceedings in the case of Helena Ramirez versus Ethan Sinclair will now begin," he announced. Margaret rose smoothly, stepping forward to deliver her opening statement. "Your Honor, today we will present the truth behind the wrongful dismissal of my client, Helena Ramirez, and the deliberate neglect of her son, Gabriel." Margaret began, her voice clear and authoritative. "We will show that Mr. Sinclair, despite his public image, failed in his most basic responsibilities as an employer and as a father. This case is not about seeking revenge or financial gain. It is about justice and accountability." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, but Margaret continued unfazed. "We have evidence, witnesses, and the testimony of those who were there. The facts will speak for themselves." Reed stood next, his movements deliberate, his smile tight. "Your Honor, this lawsuit is an attempt to tarnish the name of a respected businessman. The plaintiff's claims are baseless and motivated by personal grievances. We will show that Mr. Sinclair has no recollection of any improper relationship with Ms. Ramirez, and we will prove that this case is nothing more than a fabrication." Helena's fingers curled into her palms as she fought to remain composed. The words stung, even though she had anticipated this strategy. Gabriel sat up straighter, a defiant glint in his eyes as he listened. Margaret called Helena as the first witness. The room seemed to shrink as Helena walked to the stand, each step feeling heavier than the last. She took her seat, swore to tell the truth, and met Margaret's steady gaze. "Helena, can you describe your relationship with Mr. Sinclair during your time working in his home?" Margaret asked, her tone gentle but firm. Helena inhaled slowly, steadying herself. "I started as a maid in Mr. Sinclair's household over 16 years ago. Over time, our relationship became more personal, though it was kept hidden from everyone else. When I discovered I was pregnant, I told him, hoping he would support me." Margaret nodded. "And how did he respond?" "He was angry," Helena said, her voice faltering only slightly. "He said it would ruin everything, his reputation, his family's status. He offered to pay me to leave and stay quiet. When I refused, I was fired the next day, with no warning, no severance. Just a letter saying my services were no longer needed." There was a sharp intake of breath from somewhere in the audience, and Helena's gaze flickered over to Ethan, who sat rigidly, eyes narrowed. Margaret continued, lifting a stack of papers. "These are the letters Miss Ramirez wrote to Mr. Sinclair after her dismissal, pleading for assistance. They were ignored. Your Honor, we ask that these letters be entered into evidence." Judge Whitfield nodded, taking the documents. Margaret turned back to Helena, her expression softening. "Thank you, Helena. No further questions." Reed approached, his eyes sharp as he began his cross-examination. "Miss Ramirez, you claim there was a relationship with Mr. Sinclair. Do you have any physical evidence of this beyond these so-called letters? Photos? Gifts? Anything tangible?" Helena met his gaze, forcing her voice to remain steady. "No, there are no photographs or gifts. We were careful, and it was always kept private." Reed's smile was thin. "Convenient, isn't it? No further questions." Helena returned to her seat, feeling Gabriel's reassuring touch on her arm. The truth was out, and despite the doubts being cast, she felt a strange sense of relief. They had started the fight, and they wouldn't back down. Bookmark. The morning sun filtered through the narrow courthouse windows as Gabriel prepared to take the stand. Helena watched him, a mix of pride and apprehension tightening her chest. This was the moment she had dreaded and anticipated in equal measure, the moment her son would step forward to tell his story, bearing the pain he'd carried for years. Margaret stood beside him as he raised his right hand and swore to tell the truth. The courtroom fell silent, a collective breath held as the young man settled into the witness chair. Gabriel's eyes were dark and steady, unwavering as they met the gaze of the judge. "Gabriel," Margaret began, her tone softer than it had been during Helena's testimony, "can you tell the court what it has been like growing up without knowing your father?" Gabriel took a moment, his fingers gripping the edge of the chair. "It's been hard," he said, his voice clear but heavy with emotion. "Growing up, I'd watch other kids with their dads, playing ball, laughing, just being there. I always wondered why I didn't have that. I asked my mom about him all the time, and she said he wasn't part of our lives because he chose not to be." Helena's throat tightened as she listened, the weight of each word sinking into the room like stones. Margaret nodded, encouraging Gabriel to continue. "When I got older, I understood more. It wasn't just that he wasn't around, it was that he knew about me and chose to ignore me. That hurt the most," Gabriel said, glancing briefly at Ethan, whose expression remained stony and impassive. Margaret's eyes never left Gabriel as she spoke. "And how did it feel when you found out that Ethan Sinclair is your father?" Gabriel's jaw clenched. "At first, I was angry that he could just pretend I didn't exist, even though he knew I was out there. I couldn't understand how someone could be so indifferent." He paused, the pain in his voice piercing the silence. "I needed answers. I needed him to see that I was not just an inconvenience he could ignore. That's why I wanted my mom to take this to court. It's not about money, it's about knowing that he can't run from what he did." Margaret smiled gently, nodding in acknowledgement. "Thank you, Gabriel. No further questions." Reed approached, his gaze calculated and sharp. Gabriel, you mentioned that you've grown up watching other kids with their fathers. Isn't it true that your mother did everything in her power to provide for you, to make sure you had a good life? Gabriel's eyes met Reed's, unwavering. Yes, she did. She worked multiple jobs, sacrificed sleep, and put me before everything. But that doesn't change the fact that Ethan Sinclair is my father, and he abandoned us. It's not fair that she had to do everything on her own while he acted like we didn't matter. Reed's eyebrow arched slightly. So this lawsuit is about fairness then? Or is it about something else, like money? Isn't it true that your mother could have pursued child support years ago but chose not to? Gabriel's cheeks flushed, not with embarrassment but with anger. She didn't pursue it because she wanted peace. She didn't want to make things harder or draw attention. But I'm the one who asked her to do this now, because it's about holding him accountable. It's not just about money, it's about facing the truth. Reed's smirk faltered, replaced by a slight narrowing of his eyes. No further questions. As Gabriel stepped down, the room seemed to breathe again. He returned to his seat beside Helena, who reached over and squeezed his hand. You did so well, she whispered, tears brimming in her eyes. Thanks, Mom, Gabriel replied, his voice quieter now, the adrenaline of the testimony wearing off. Margaret called Rosa to the stand next, her testimony painting a vivid picture of the days leading up to Helena's sudden dismissal. We all suspected something, Rosa said, her voice steady. We knew how Mr. Sinclair acted around Helena, how their conversations lasted longer than with anyone else. And then one day, she was just gone. The murmurs in the room grew louder as Rosa recounted seeing Helena's tear-streaked face the day she left the estate. Reed's attempts to discredit her fell flat in the face of her sincere words. Helena felt a flicker of hope. Gabriel's truth had been laid bare, and Rosa's testimony had bolstered their story. They were no longer silent. The fight was unfolding, and the truth was beginning to crack through Ethan's carefully built facade. The room grew tense as Margaret called for the next witness, but soon it was time for Ethan Sinclair to take the stand. The whispers in the courtroom stilled as he walked up, his polished shoes clicking against the wooden floor. He took his seat, maintaining an air of calm, a practiced expression that betrayed no emotion. Helena's heart clenched as she watched the man she once knew now seem like a stranger. Ethan swore the oath, his deep voice as confident as ever. Margaret stood, eyes narrowed with determination. Mr. Sinclair, can you explain the nature of your relationship with Helena Ramirez during her employment at your residence? Ethan took a breath, the corners of his mouth tightening. Miss Ramirez was an employee in my home, nothing more. Any implications of a personal relationship are simply misunderstandings or rumors. Helena felt Gabriel tense beside her, and she placed a hand on his arm, willing him to stay calm. Margaret raised an eyebrow at Ethan's carefully chosen words. And yet, multiple witnesses have testified to seeing you spend extra time with Ms. Ramirez and acting in ways that suggested a more personal relationship. How do you respond to that? Ethan's eyes flicked to the gallery, taking in the curious faces. People talk, Miss Lane. Staff gossip is hardly evidence. My interactions with Ms. Ramirez were professional. If anyone interpreted them differently, that's beyond my control. Margaret's voice grew firmer. Mr. Sinclair, we have letters that Helena Ramirez sent to you after her dismissal, letters asking for help and acknowledgement. Are you saying you did not receive them? Ethan's jaw tightened subtly. I received countless letters and correspondence, Miss Lane. I cannot be expected to remember every single one, especially from years ago. And what about the sudden nature of Miss Ramirez's dismissal? Witnesses have testified that she was terminated without warning shortly after informing you of her pregnancy. Ethan's composure faltered for just a moment, the slightest tick in his jaw betraying discomfort. Decisions about staffing were handled by my management team. I trust their judgment when it comes to the needs of my household. Margaret stepped closer, her tone incisive. Isn't it true that firing an employee upon learning of their pregnancy, especially under these circumstances, suggests not just poor judgment, but personal motive, Mr. Sinclair? Ethan's gaze hardened, but he managed to keep his voice steady. That's your interpretation, not the truth. Margaret paused, letting the weight of his words linger in the silence. No further questions, Your Honor. Reed stood, buttoning his suit jacket as he approached. His voice was smooth, rehearsed. "Mr. Sinclair, thank you for clarifying. Let's discuss your reputation. As a prominent businessman known for philanthropy, have you faced any similar allegations before?" Ethan shook his head, his voice growing more confident. "No, never. My record speaks for itself. This lawsuit is the first time anything like this has been alleged against me, and I believe it to be an attempt to tarnish my reputation." Reed nodded, casting a glance at the jury. "Thank you, Mr. Sinclair. No further questions." Ethan stepped down, a wave of whispers rippling through the courtroom as he walked back to his seat. Helena's eyes followed him, a complex tangle of anger and sorrow twisting in her chest. She had expected his denials, but hearing them delivered so coldly still stung. Gabriel's expression was unreadable, his eyes fixed on the back of Ethan's head as if searching for a crack in the facade. Margaret leaned over and whispered, "We're not done yet. The jury will see the inconsistencies. Trust the process." The courtroom session continued, with more witnesses called, each piece of testimony adding layers to the case. Rosa's detailed account of the day Helena was dismissed, the way Ethan had acted in the days leading up to it, and the letters entered into evidence painted a picture of a powerful man willing to abandon his responsibilities. When the court adjourned for the day, the atmosphere buzzed with tension. Reporters flocked to the hallway, their questions a cacophony that Helena, Gabriel, and Margaret navigated as they exited. Helena glanced back once, catching a glimpse of Ethan as he spoke to his lawyer, his face tight and unreadable. The battle was still raging, but for the first time Helena felt the scales beginning to shift. Look back. The day of the closing arguments arrived with an air of finality that weighed heavily on Helena. The courtroom was packed, buzzing with anticipation. The case had captivated not only those present but also the public, who followed the updates closely in the news. The stakes were clear. This was not just a trial about one man's indiscretions, but a fight for justice for a mother and son who had been silenced for too long. Margaret Lane rose first, her expression steely but composed. She walked to the center of the courtroom, her gaze sweeping the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have heard the testimony and seen the evidence. You have heard how Helena Ramirez was not just an employee, but someone whose life was turned upside down by a man who chose power over responsibility. This case is not about revenge, nor is it about tarnishing a reputation. It is about justice, about ensuring that Ethan Sinclair faces the consequences of his actions." Margaret's voice softened slightly as she turned toward Gabriel, who sat quietly, his eyes dark with emotion. Gabriel grew up not knowing his father, wondering why he was abandoned, while Mr. Sinclair continued his life of privilege and influence, ignoring the existence of his son. Helena worked tirelessly to provide for Gabriel, without the support that any responsible parent would have offered. It is time for that neglect to end. It is time for accountability. Reed stood next, his posture confident and voice smooth as ever. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what we have here is a story built on assumptions and embellished memories. Yes, Miss Ramirez was employed by Mr. Sinclair, but the claims she and her witnesses have made are unsupported by concrete evidence. My client has spent his life building a reputation based on integrity and service. This lawsuit is nothing more than an attempt to exploit that success." He paused for effect, glancing at the jury. "I urge you to see through the emotions and focus on the facts, or the lack thereof. There is no tangible proof of any affair, no concrete evidence linking my client to these claims. Justice must be rooted in certainty, not speculation." The courtroom fell silent as Judge Whitfield spoke. "The jury will now deliberate." Helena's heart pounded as the jury filed out of the room. The weight of the past weeks, the testimony, and the raw emotional energy pressed down on her. Gabriel leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "No matter what happens, Mom, we did everything we could." Helena nodded, squeezing his hand. "Yes, we did." Time seemed to stretch endlessly as they waited. Minutes ticked by like hours, each second heavy with possibility. Finally, the jury returned, their expressions neutral and unreadable. The foreperson handed a slip of paper to the judge, who read it silently before addressing the court. "This court has reached a decision in the case of Helena Ramirez versus Ethan Sinclair," Judge Whitfield announced, his voice steady and measured. Regarding the claim of wrongful termination, it has been determined that the evidence supports that Ms. Ramirez was indeed dismissed without just cause following the disclosure of her pregnancy. The court rules in favor of Helena Ramirez. A soft gasp rippled through the audience, and Helena felt tears sting her eyes. She dared a glance at Gabriel, who gave her a faint smile, hope flickering in his eyes. Judge Whitfield continued. As for the claim of child support, the evidence, including the testimony and submitted letters, indicates that Mr. Sinclair was aware of his obligations but chose to avoid them. The court rules that Mr. Sinclair is the father of Gabriel Ramirez and is ordered to provide retroactive child support along with ongoing payments. A murmur of disbelief swept through the crowd. Reed's face tightened, but Ethan's expression remained cold, a muscle in his jaw the only sign of tension. Gabriel's hand gripped Helena's tightly, the relief palpable between them. Judge Whitfield's final words resonated through the courtroom. It is my hope that this ruling serves as a reminder that no one, no matter how influential, is above taking responsibility for their actions. The court is adjourned. The gavel came down, and the room erupted into noise. Reporters surged forward, questions flying as camera flashes illuminated the room like a storm. Margaret turned to Helena, her smile warm and proud. "You did it." Helena swallowed, emotion overwhelming her. "We did it," she said, her voice trembling as she looked at Gabriel. They had stood up to the man who had cast them aside, and they had won. At that moment, surrounded by chaos but anchored by each other, they knew their lives would never be the same again. The courthouse steps were a blur of motion and sound as Helena and Gabriel stepped out, shielded by Margaret's calm guidance. Reporters pushed forward, microphones thrust out, questions overlapping into a chaotic chorus. "Helena, how do you feel now that you've won?" "Gabriel, what does this mean for your future?" The flash of cameras was blinding, capturing their exhausted yet triumphant faces. Helena glanced at Gabriel, who met her gaze with a small, knowing smile. Despite the noise around them, there was a quiet understanding between them. They had come out of the shadows and faced their greatest challenge together. Margaret raised her hand, commanding the crowd's attention. "Today's verdict is a victory for justice," Margaret announced, her voice steady and authoritative. "Helena Ramirez and Gabriel have shown immense strength and resilience in standing up for what is right. This ruling is proof that no matter one's influence or power, the truth will find its way." The crowd erupted into questions again, but Margaret guided Helena and Gabriel down the steps to a waiting car, shutting the door against the barrage of noise. Inside the vehicle, the sudden silence was almost startling. Helena leaned back against the seat, exhaling a shaky breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Gabriel turned to her, his expression shifting from relief to something deeper, more contemplative. "It's over, Mom," he said, his voice low and almost disbelieving. "We did it." Helena reached for his hand, the warmth of his fingers grounding her. "Yes, we did," she whispered, eyes stinging with tears of both exhaustion and joy. She looked out the window as the city passed by, its streets bustling with life, unaware of the monumental shift that had just taken place in their lives. Back at their small apartment, the air felt different, lighter. It was as if the weight that had settled on them for so many years had finally been lifted. The evening sun filtered through the sheer curtains, painting the room with a soft, golden glow. Helena moved to the kitchen, where framed photos of Gabriel at various stages of his life lined the shelves. They told the story of a childhood shaped by her fierce determination and love, but shadowed by the absence of the man who had denied them. Gabriel walked up beside her, studying one of the photos. A picture from his first day of school, his small hand gripping hers, eyes bright with excitement and just a hint of nervousness. "Do you think he'll ever try to be part of my life now?" he asked, breaking the silence. Helena's gaze softened as she looked at her son. The question had crossed her mind too, but the answer was complicated. "I don't know, Gabriel. That's something only he can decide. But what I do know is that no matter what happens, you know who you are, and you know your worth. You're strong, with or without him." Gabriel nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "We're better off with what we have," he said, echoing a sentiment that Helena had always believed but now felt more certain of than ever before. They had faced the truth, confronted their fears, and come out stronger. The days following the trial were a mix of newfound freedom and adjustment. Reporters occasionally loitered near their building, hoping for another comment or a candid photo, but the buzz began to fade as other stories took their place. The child support payments began to come in, a tangible reminder of the victory they had fought so hard for. With the financial strain easing, Helena finally allowed herself to breathe a little easier. She used some of the funds to clear lingering debts and started looking into better opportunities for Gabriel's education. They talked about Crestwood High, known for its excellent academic programs and strong extracurriculars. Gabriel's eyes lit up at the idea, the prospect of a fresh start more appealing than ever. One evening, Rosa stopped by, a plant in hand as a housewarming gift for this new chapter of their lives. Over steaming cups of coffee, they talked about the trial, about courage, and the ways their lives were intertwined by shared moments and unspoken support. Rosa's eyes shone with pride as she said, "Helena, what you did has given hope to more people than you know." Helena looked at Gabriel, who was sitting at the table, scribbling notes for a school project, his brow furrowed in concentration. The sight filled her with an overwhelming sense of gratitude and peace. "I was scared," she admitted, looking back at Rosa, "but it was the right thing to do." The apartment felt alive that night, filled with laughter and warmth. As the weeks turned into months, Helena began to see the tangible changes brought about by the court's decision. The child support payments allowed her to make important improvements in their lives that had previously felt impossible. The worn-out furniture in their small apartment was replaced piece by piece, and Helena found herself finally considering the future with hope instead of trepidation. Gabriel had enrolled at Crestwood High, and the change was almost immediate. He came home with stories about new friends and classes that challenged him in ways that excited him. The new environment seemed to fuel his ambition, and Helena saw the confident, intelligent young man he was becoming. It was a far cry from the boy who had once asked hesitant questions about a father he never knew. One evening, Gabriel came home later than usual, a wide smile on his face. "Mom, I joined the robotics club," he announced, setting his backpack down by the kitchen door. Helena's eyes widened in surprise and delight. "That's wonderful. I'm so proud of you," she said, embracing him. The relief in her chest was profound, knowing that the shadow of Ethan Sinclair's absence no longer defined their lives, but had instead become a chapter they had closed together. As she prepared dinner that night, Helena found herself thinking of all the moments she'd once feared they would never have. The laughter as Gabriel recounted a joke from a new friend, the way he spoke about his projects with excitement, all of it was proof that their fight had been worth it. The next morning, while organizing a stack of papers, Helena found herself stopping at an old photograph of her and Gabriel taken years ago. She traced the outline of his younger face, recalling the struggles they'd shared. The past felt like a story she could now tell without bitterness, one that had shaped them but did not own them. Determined to start pursuing her own long-held dreams, Helena signed up for an art class at the community center, a hobby she had abandoned years ago when survival left no room for creativity. When she told Gabriel about it, his eyes lit up with pride. "That's amazing, Mom," he said, then paused thoughtfully. "You know, we should take a cooking class together sometime. It'd be fun to try something new." Helena laughed, a sound that felt foreign and freeing at the same time. "A cooking class? Are you sure you're ready to see me fail spectacularly at something?" she teased, a playful grin spreading across her face. "Hey, we can fail together," Gabriel replied with a chuckle. "That's kind of our thing, isn't it?" She nodded, warmth spreading through her chest. "Yes, it is." Their lives found a rhythm, one marked by moments of peace and the occasional challenge that no longer seemed insurmountable. Rosa continued to visit, her presence a comforting reminder of how far they had come. Sometimes they would reminisce about the trial and the way it had tested them all, but those conversations always ended with laughter or a toast to the strength they discovered in themselves. One day, while tidying the apartment, Helena received a letter in the mail. It bore no return address, but was marked with handwriting that she recognized immediately. Her breath caught as she opened it and read the short, formal note from Ethan Sinclair. It expressed no apology or admission of guilt, only an acknowledgement that he intended to comply with the court's ruling and that he wished Gabriel well. Helena stared at the note for a long moment, the words distant yet somehow closing a chapter in her heart. She folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, choosing not to dwell on what might come next from him. Gabriel would know if he asked, but she felt no need to bring it up. Their happiness wasn't tied to that man's actions. It was built on the resilience they had forged together. That night, as Helena and Gabriel prepared dinner, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The past had defined them once, but now they were the authors of their own stories. Whatever lay ahead, they were ready, side by side. Helena found herself spending more time at the community center, where the art class became a source of joy she hadn't experienced in years. The smell of paint, the scratch of charcoal on paper, and the hum of conversation in the studio were reminders that life was full of possibilities beyond survival. She rediscovered a part of herself that had been buried under years of struggle, each sketch and brushstroke breathing life back into dreams she thought she'd lost. Gabriel, meanwhile, thrived at Crestwood High. He joined the robotics club and even considered running for a position on the student council. The house was often filled with the sound of his laughter as he recounted his day or shared stories about his new friends. Helena marveled at the transformation, feeling grateful that they had fought for this for him. One Saturday morning, as sunlight spilled through the kitchen window, Gabriel sat across from Helena with an old photo album in hand. He flipped through pictures of birthdays, holidays, and everyday moments, reminders of the years they had spent navigating life without anyone else's help. "Mom," Gabriel said, pausing at a photo of them on the couch, him as a toddler nestled against her, both of them grinning at the camera. "Looking at these, I get it now. Everything we've been through made us who we are." Helena reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of the photograph. "It wasn't easy," she said, her voice soft with the weight of memory. "But we came out stronger." He nodded, a serious look in his eyes. "I used to think about what it would be like if he had been part of our lives. But now, I'm not sure it matters as much as I once thought." Helena's heart swelled with a mix of relief and pride. Gabriel's journey to this understanding had been hard-won, and knowing that he could see beyond the absence, beyond the hurt, felt like a victory. "We don't need him to be whole," she said, her voice steady and sure. "We never did." The thought of Ethan Sinclair still lingered in the background of their lives, a shadow that occasionally surfaced in the form of a news article or an offhand comment in the neighborhood. But with each passing day, his relevance faded, replaced by the brightness of their present and the promise of their future. One evening, after Helena returned from her art class, she sat with Gabriel at the kitchen table, where a flyer for community events lay. "There's a cooking class starting next month," she said, a playful smile curving her lips. "Are you still interested in joining me?" Gabriel's face lit up, echoing the boyish excitement that had once seemed distant. "Absolutely," he said. "Let's show them what real kitchen disasters look like." They laughed together, the sound filling the apartment with warmth. Moments like these reminded Helena of the importance of claiming joy and building new memories that were theirs alone. It was as if the trials they had endured had paved the way for these small yet profound victories. The following week, Gabriel came home with news that the robotics team had made it to the regional competition. "It's going to be tough, but we have a real shot," he said, eyes bright with determination. "I know you'll do great," Helena replied, pride spilling over in her smile. "You're unstoppable." "Because I learned from the best," he said, the sincerity in his voice striking her heart. It was one of those rare moments when words seemed unnecessary, their bond speaking louder than anything they could say. As Helena lay in bed that night, she reflected on how much their lives had changed. The years of struggle had taught them resilience, and the battle for justice had proven their strength. But it was the love and trust between them that had carried them through everything. Outside, the city hummed with life, the lights from distant buildings flickering like stars. Helena closed her eyes, breathing in the peace that now filled her home. She no longer feared what tomorrow might bring. she embraced it, knowing they would face it together. Go back. A few weeks after the verdict, life settled into a rhythm that felt almost surreal in its normalcy. Helena had found a part-time job at an art supply store, one that allowed her to work flexible hours while continuing her art classes and spending more time with Gabriel. The days were fuller and brighter, each one a reminder that their story had taken a turn they could finally celebrate. One afternoon, Rosa visited with fresh bread from a nearby bakery. They sat together in the cozy kitchen, the rich scent of coffee mingling with the warmth of the sun streaming in through the window. The conversation shifted from small talk to deeper reflections. "It's funny, isn't it?" Rosa said, breaking off a piece of the bread. "How life can change so quickly. A few months ago, you were fighting just to be heard, and now look at you." Helena smiled, the corners of her eyes crinkling with the kind of joy she hadn't allowed herself to feel for a long time. "It still feels a bit unreal," she admitted. "But it's a good kind of change. For so many years, everything felt like a battle. Now, it feels like we're finally living." Rosa nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "You deserve this, Helena. You and Gabriel both do. You faced what most people would run from, and you came out stronger." Helena glanced at the door as it opened, and Gabriel walked in, a grin on his face. He set his school bag down and joined them at the table. "Hey, Rosa," he greeted. "Did Mom tell you we're starting a cooking class next week? Prepare for some questionable meals." Rosa laughed, the sound filling the room. "Oh, I'll be sure to keep my phone handy for a rescue call," she teased, and they all laughed together. Later that evening, as Gabriel settled in with a book, Helena took out a new canvas she'd bought on her way home. She set it on the easel by the window, where the last light of day softened into dusk. Picking up her brush, she let her thoughts drift as she painted. The way Gabriel had smiled as he told Rosa about their plans, the ease with which he now carried himself. The colors on the canvas blended into warm hues, capturing the feeling of home and hope. She didn't paint the past anymore. Gone were the dark, shadowy figures and abstract expressions of struggle. Now she painted light, resilience, and love. It was her way of closing a chapter, of telling the story of a life reclaimed. "Mom?" Gabriel's voice called softly from the living room. "Yes, sweetheart?" Helena responded, turning to see him standing in the doorway, his face lit by a gentle curiosity. "I was thinking," he began, his eyes thoughtful, "maybe we could take a road trip this summer. Just us, somewhere new. We've never really traveled before." Helena's heart swelled at the idea. She had always dreamed of seeing the world outside the city with him, but money and time had always been obstacles. Now, for the first time, it felt possible. "I'd love that," she said, her smile widening as she pictured the open road, the laughter, and the memories they'd make. "Let's start planning it." Gabriel's face lit up with excitement, and he crossed the room to hug her. "Thanks, Mom, for everything." Helena hugged him back, the familiar scent of his hair and the solid feel of his arms anchoring her to the present. "No, Gabriel," she whispered, the words filled with emotion. "Thank you for giving me a reason to fight, for reminding me of what really matters." They pulled apart, and Gabriel looked at her with the sincerity only a son could offer. "We make a good team, don't we?" "The best," she said, ruffling his hair and laughing as he ducked away. The room was quiet again, but it was the peaceful kind, filled with the contentment of a family who had found their way through the storm and come out the other side, stronger and closer than ever. The future stretched ahead of them, full of promise and light, and for the first time in a long while, Helena felt ready to embrace every bit of it. The weeks turned into months, and with each passing day, Helena and Gabriel settled further into their new reality. The once small apartment now felt expansive with the dreams they dared to entertain. Helena's job at the art supply store blossomed into more than just work. It became a place where she found community. She shared stories with customers, recommended supplies for aspiring artists, and even displayed one of her own paintings, a vibrant piece symbolizing growth and resilience. Gabriel thrived at Crestwood High, diving headfirst into his studies and extracurriculars. The robotics team, which had seemed like a long shot months earlier, advanced to the finals in their regional competition. The school buzzed with excitement, and Gabriel's name was now associated with leadership and talent. His newfound confidence spread through their lives like sunlight, warming everything it touched. One day after school, Gabriel came home with a gleam in his eye and a letter clutched tightly in his hand. "Mom, look at this," he said, barely containing his excitement. Helena took the letter, her heart already skipping in anticipation. "It's from the university," he said, bouncing slightly on the balls of his feet. Helena's eyes scanned the paper, and when she reached the part congratulating him on a partial scholarship for their engineering program, she couldn't stop the tears that welled up in her eyes. "Gabriel, this is incredible," she exclaimed, pulling him into a tight embrace. The letter shook slightly in her trembling hands as she felt the weight of every sacrifice, every sleepless night, transform into something beautiful and tangible. "I'm so proud of you," he laughed, the sound rich with joy. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mom." The news spread quickly through their circle of friends. Rosa came by that evening with a celebratory cake, and they toasted Gabriel's future, the small kitchen ringing with laughter and cheer. The walls that once witnessed quiet resilience now resounded with triumph. With the scholarship and child support easing their financial burden, Helena and Gabriel began planning the road trip they had talked about. It became a project they worked on together, mapping routes and listing landmarks they wanted to visit. The excitement in Gabriel's eyes as he plotted their path was worth every battle they had fought to get here. The day before they set off on their journey, Helena found herself alone in the apartment, surrounded by the quiet that came only after years of chaos. She sat down at the table where so many moments had unfolded, tears, decisions, and now plans for a brighter future. Her eyes fell on the drawer that held the letter from Ethan Sinclair. For a moment, she contemplated its contents, the terse acknowledgement that came too late to matter. She took a deep breath, stood up, and pulled the letter from its resting place. She held it over the trash can, her heart steady as she let it go. The paper fluttered down, taking with it the last remnants of a past that no longer defined her. In its place was the certainty of her and Gabriel's bond, stronger and more meaningful than anything Ethan's recognition could offer. The next morning, the sun rose in a cloudless sky, casting a warm, golden light that filled the apartment. Gabriel packed the last of their bags into the car, his eyes bright with anticipation. Helena locked the door behind them, feeling as if she were closing the final chapter of an old book. "Ready, Mom?" Gabriel asked, his voice filled with excitement as he settled into the driver's seat. Helena smiled, the road stretching out before them, a symbol of everything they had earned. "I'm ready," she said, sliding into the passenger seat. They pulled out of the driveway, the city soon giving way to open roads and the promise of adventure. The car was filled with the sound of music and laughter, the miles ahead a canvas waiting to be painted with new memories. For the first time in as long as she could remember, Helena felt truly free, the weight of the past replaced by the boundless possibilities of tomorrow. As they drove, she reached out and took Gabriel's hand, holding on not out of fear but out of the joy of knowing they had made it. Together. Helena and Gabriel's journey is one of resilience, love, and unwavering determination. Their story shows that, despite life's toughest challenges, facing the truth and fighting for what is right can lead to growth and newfound strength. The battle they endured against someone as powerful as Ethan Sinclair was not just a pursuit of justice, but a declaration of their worth and the value of their shared bond. The years of struggle taught them that true power does not come from wealth or status, but from standing up for oneself and embracing the support of those who matter most. Gabriel's path from a boy filled with unanswered questions to a confident young man pursuing his dreams highlights the importance of perseverance. Meanwhile, Helena's transformation from a mother burdened by the past to a woman rediscovering her passions is a testament to the strength found in self-belief and healing. Together, their story teaches that healing and success don't come from external validation, but from facing life's challenges with courage and love. This story serves as a reminder that no matter what obstacles stand in our way, it's possible to rise above them, to carve out a life defined not by past wrongs, but by the choices we make to move forward. It's a lesson in finding peace, forgiveness, and the understanding that while life may not always be fair, the resilience we build can lead to new chapters filled with hope and possibility. If you found this story inspiring, please comment with a 1. If you thought it was very moving, comment with a 2. We'd love to hear your stories too. Share your experiences and reflections in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss any upcoming stories filled with hope and motivation. Your thoughts and feedback mean the world to us. Join the conversation and let us know what you took away from this journey.